Wow. You know something, guys? Even after all these years, I still get chills every time I hear that theme, and it never ever gets old. Hey guys, this is Warhawk Beyond 2040 in the house, bringing to you a very special video, courtesy of yours truly, and this is going to be a awesome yet outrageous theory on how I would like to see the X-Men brought into the MCU. And I figured the timing couldn't be more perfect, as we all know that the X-Men Dark Phoenix movie is out this week on cinemas worldwide. And I figured this would be a great opportunity to talk all X-Men. We're going to be talking basically anything and everything that is X-Men. So, with that all said, sit back, relax, and let's do this. Now, I first became aware of the X-Men, probably like all of you guys. My first introduction to the X-Men was the Fox Kids animated series back in the 90s. And I have to say, probably like all of you, this cartoon absolutely blew not my mind, blew my brains. Now, this cartoon was very, very unique in terms of storytelling and in terms of character representation. Now, what made the X-Men such a unique team? They weren't like the Justice League, they weren't like the Fantastic Four, hell, they weren't even anything like the Avengers. These guys were not loved by the public, story-wise I'm talking about, and these guys weren't embraced by society. They were pretty much a band of misfits that didn't belong in the real world. So it was very interesting to have a group of heroes who weren't necessarily hated, but they were feared. And that made it really interesting. So from there on, I was a big fan of the X-Men straight away. And I think it's the only show, there probably are a few out there, but it was one of the few shows that absolutely stayed 100% faithful to the comic books. I mean, the episodes were pretty much adaptations of comic books, just made into animation with voice actors, and it was so cool. It was such a good show, and it went on for about, I think was possibly 5 seasons. I'm going to have to double check there, but it went on for a long time, let's just say that, and every episode was just top notch. And what can I say really? 5 stars, period. Shortly after, my dad bought me a copy of Spider-Man and the Uncanny X-Men, a graphic novel compilation, which compiled some of the best crossovers, team-up stories of Spider-Man and the X-Men. And that was my true gateway into the X-Men comic books. And I think probably Spider-Man as well. I mean, I already known about Spider-Man already, so to have Spider-Man and the X-Men teaming up together was a big deal for me. So it went from there really. So fast forward to the year 2000, and we saw the first ever X-Men movie hit the big screen, and this was a huge deal for all comic book geeks like myself. And at the time there was very few superhero team movies. I mean, we had a number of Batman movies, but there was very few films from Marvel on the cinema. So to have the X-Men hit the big screen was a huge deal. And I remember my dad taking me to see the first ever X-Men movie, and I didn't know what to expect. I mean, by that point, I had already grown up with the animated series. I'd already started reading the comic books, so I was well established with who the X Men were and what they were about. But I didn't know what to expect on the big screen, and soon as that first opening shot we saw of the concentration camp in Poland, where we see young Magneto bending the fences, I was like, wow, this was big. This wasn't like the X Men animated series at all, and I absolutely loved it. It was great. It did feel a little bit like a TV pilot at times, but the overall execution was just absolutely amazing. You had Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, you had Halle Berry as Storm, you had Ian McKellen as Magneto, Patrick Stewart as Professor Xavier, you had James Marsden as Cyclops. It was a massive, massive deal, and you had Famke Janssen as Jean Grey. I mean, you had pretty much an all-star cast from top to bottom, and the film absolutely delivered 100%. And it was, to many people, and myself included, this was the start of the whole boom period of superhero movies. So, with all that said, we fast forward to 2003 and we got another X-Men movie, X2. And this is a movie I would say that the sequel is better than the first one. Not that I was saying there was anything wrong with the first one. The first one was good, but the second one, still to this day, I say is one of the best X-Men movies of all time. It was a much stronger story. The way they balanced all the characters was tremendously well done, and we was introduced to a couple of new characters. We were introduced to Lady Deathstrike, who is played by the lovely Kelly Hu. Whew, wow. Anyway, and also Shawn Ashmore was introduced, and he played Iceman. Now, Iceman, for many hardcore fans out there, myself included, Iceman was one of the original founding members of the X-Men, going back to 1963 of the comic books. So to have Iceman in this movie was a big deal. It was a really big deal. Probably not as a big deal as other characters that appeared in the film, but for me it was a bit of a big deal to have one of the original X-Men members in the movie. And I still say to this day, X2 is one of the best superhero movies of all time, and one of the few films where the sequel was better than the first one. So fast forward to 2006, and we had another X-Men movie, X-Men 3, The Last Stand. I didn't like this one. Didn't like this one at all. Not as much as I enjoyed the first two. And I had a few issues with this movie. For starters, they killed off Cyclops, who is one of my favourite X-Men members of all time. They killed him off in like the first half of the movie, and I wasn't a fan of the way they handled the Phoenix Saga. I felt they kind of rushed that a little bit. I've always said if you're going to do the Phoenix Saga, do it right and make it feel big. I wasn't a fan of it. And also I was very upset they killed off Professor Xavier. Just killed him off. Just didn't like that at all. There was a number of things I didn't like about this movie. Now, me and my friend talk about this all the time, and we both agreed that if this movie had been about the cure, where mutants could take the cure and be stripped of their powers permanently and live their life as human beings, that would have been a much better movie. That would have been an amazing film, but I don't know. It just felt like they were trying to cram too much into one film, and lots of characters got lost in the shuffle. I just wasn't a fan of this movie. I mean, it wasn't terrible, like, I don't know, like the Fantastic Four films, but it wasn't as strong as the first two. You know, for a trilogy, normally with trilogies, it's very hard. You get three films that are all good. It's very hard. I get that, but I'm sorry. You start off strong and then go out weak. It didn't fly with me, not one bit. So, with that all said, X-Men 1, loved it. X-Men 2, classic, enough said. X3, not so much. And this, I think this would be the last X-Men film that we had pretty much most of the original cast together, as far as a trilogy of movies is concerned. So, after 2006, there wasn't any more X-Men movies for a long, long time. Until we get to 2009 with the release of X-Men Origins Wolverine. Now, this movie was more about the origin of Logan and how he became Wolverine and how he became part of the Weapon X program and his relationship with Stryker. And this movie was not the greatest, but it wasn't terrible. It was okay. But I went back and watched it again, and it wasn't as bad as I remembered. It was okay. Hugh Jackman kicked ass, like he always does. The only issue I had with this movie, and I think we can all safely say we agree on this, was Deadpool. Deadpool just looked absolutely crap. And that's nothing against Ryan Reynolds. Ryan Reynolds, lovely guy, decent actor, but Deadpool just looked terrible. Thank God Ryan Reynolds was given a second chance in 2016 and redeemed himself with a much better Deadpool and a more comic book accurate look. But apart from that, I had a couple of issues with this film, but nothing to really go mental over. By and large, it was okay. It was okay. Wouldn't put it as one of my favourite movies of all time, but thought it was. It was okay. So after Wolverine Origins, we fast forward to 2011 with the release of X-Men First Class. Now, I read that originally X-Men First Class was going to be a Magneto origin movie, and it was going to be about Eric Lensher growing up, learning about how he got his powers, seeing him in his younger days, and how he met Charles Xavier, and we would also see how Eric Lensher became the man that we would come to know him as. But because Charles Xavier plays such a big role in the origin of Magneto, they decided to make it into a X-Men prequel. And you know what? Best decision they ever made. It was absolutely fantastic, and just like the title of the movie says, it was indeed first class. Absolutely fantastic. Probably one of the best X-Men movies ever made. I would definitely put this up there with X-Men 2 in terms of story, execution, everything. And one of the reasons why I feel this film worked so well, it was no focus at all on Wolverine. It's nothing against Hugh Jackman. Hugh Jackman quite possibly is the definitive Wolverine, and he's kicked ass. But I felt that a lot of the X-Men movies focus way too much on him. It's not a bad thing, but that's just my opinion. So to have this movie not feature Wolverine at all, albeit a hilarious cameo that we would see, this was the first X-Men movie to not feature Wolverine as the lead character, and it works. It works really, really well. James McAvoy was absolutely brilliant as Charles Xavier. Michael Fassbender kicked ass as Eric Lensher. We had Jennifer Lawrence as Raven / Mystique. Nicholas Hoult as Beast, Hank McCoy. Kevin Bacon as the main villain, Sebastian Shaw. It was really, really good. Absolutely brilliant. And we had, I think, Zoe Kravitz as Angel, although a different Angel to the one we would know. But overall, X-Men First Class, absolutely brilliant. And one of the things that I most liked about this film was we got to actually see how Charles ended up in a wheelchair, how he ended up being crippled. And there have been a number of versions I've read over the years. I know Magneto was responsible for putting Charles Xavier in a wheelchair. There was one version I read, they had an argument, and Magneto, I think, shoved him, and Charles went flying backwards and banged his legs. And I think there was another version where something collapsed on him due to Magneto's powers and he couldn't feel his legs. There had been a number of different versions how he ended up in a wheelchair, but I thought the way they did it in this movie was very powerful, very emotional, and it really made a statement. It made a very powerful statement, I have to say. So, overall, X-Men First Class, 5 stars, enough said. And like I said already, one of the best X-Men movies of all time. So after X-Men First Class, we fast forward to 2013, and The Wolverine came out. The Wolverine film, I would go out and say, is one of the best Wolverine movies I've ever seen. Hugh Jackman absolutely kicked ass, and this is one of his best performances as the lead. Most of the film is set in Tokyo, and we got to see more of an emotional side to Logan. He found love, and we got to see a more humanized side of him, as opposed to the animalistic side that we always see him known for. And I have to say, I really, really enjoyed it. I remember seeing this at the cinema, and I was thoroughly impressed. I mean, I didn't have any high expectations. It did exactly what I said it would do, and it delivered. I didn't have any high expectations, and I'm glad I didn't, because it ended up being probably one of my favourite Wolverine films of all time. But the highlight of the movie, for me, was the after credits scene where Logan is about to depart and everything just stops, and we see Eric Lensher, played once again wonderfully, by the way, by Ian McKellen. And I remember watching this in a cinema where you see Charles Xavier back to normal, alive and well, in his wheelchair, and I'll never forget, everybody went crazy. Everyone started clapping and cheering, because we remember that he died at the end of X-Men 3 Last Stand. So to see Patrick Stewart back as Charles Xavier was a big moment, and everybody was just losing their minds in a good way. And this helps set up for the next X-Men movie, which is Days of Future Past. Now, I first became aware of Days of Future Past back in the 90s cartoon, where Bishop travelled from the future back to the past to prevent the assassination of Senator Kelly. And he also suspected that Gambit was the one who pulled the trigger and he was the traitor. But that later turned out not to be the case, as Gambit was actually Mystique in disguise. And that was the version that I knew Days of Future Past for. That was the one I grew up with. And it was really cool. It was probably one of my favourite story arcs in the X-Men cartoon. But then recently I came across the graphic novel of Days of Future Past, where it was Kitty Pryde that went back to the past to prevent the assassination attempt. And it was pretty decent. I thought it was pretty good. But I liked the Bishop one more, because obviously that was the one I grew up with. So when they announced that the next X-Men movie and sequel to First Class was going to be Days of Future Past, I was really intrigued to see how they would pull off such a big story arc like this. I learned that Bishop wasn't going to be the one who would go back to the past. It was actually going to be Wolverine, which makes sense really, because Not only he heals fast and he never ages, it's made perfect sense. So X-Men Days of Future Past was set 10 years after First Class, so it was set in 1973, and it was really cool to see virtually all of the cast from the original trilogy and all the cast from First Class all in one movie, and it really, really worked. And I would go on to say that X Men Days of Future Past is one of the best X Men movies. I would definitely put it up there with First Class and X Men 2. It didn't really have a proper main villain. I know you had Dr. Trask, the guy who built all the Sentinels, and it was cool to see the Sentinels play a big part in the movie, but what I liked most about this film is there wasn't an actual main villain. I mean, Magneto was in the film, but he wasn't the bad guy, so to speak. And the way that the film goes back to the future and then back to the 70s was really well done, and it was so emotional. It really told a powerful story, and anyone who hasn't seen X-Men Days of Future Past, I highly recommend you watch it, and I highly also recommend you check out the Rogue Cut. It's much longer, but it's really cool, and yeah, it went on to become one of my all-time favourite movies. The highlight of the movie, I would actually have to say probably two highlights. The first one being was Charles Xavier meeting his older self, and you got to see James McAvoy and Patrick Stewart have that beautiful scene together where they talk about not losing hope. I thought that was so beautifully shot, and you know, John Ottman's score of Hope Xavier's theme playing in the background when you see everyone walking around the academy. That just was so well done. It was so beautifully shot, and everything about that scene just worked. And when you get to top actors the caliber of James McAvoy and Patrick Stewart, you know you're going to get nothing but the best. And also, the second best scene of the movie was after time was reset. Wolverine wakes up back in the present. He's back in the academy, and he sees Hank McCoy walking around, and he sees Storm walking around, and he sees Jean Grey and Scott Summers alive and well. It really felt like this was at the end. It really was a fitting end. I mean, had this had been the last X-Men movie, it would have been a great way to go out. I mean, everything about it was just brilliant. It was almost like none of these guys ever left. That's how good it was. So, yeah, I've got nothing bad to say about this movie. I would give it full 5 stars without question. And also, just when things couldn't get any better, we had a really cool after credit scene where we see a shot of Egypt, and we see a young Apocalypse standing there moving all the pyramids, and my brain just absolutely blew up. I thought, oh my god, we're actually getting Apocalypse for the next X-Men movie. And just when this film couldn't get any more better, you know, they hint at Apocalypse, which sets up for the next one, which is of course X-Men Apocalypse. Now, I remember when this one came out, I had a lot of high expectations. I was really, really excited to see how Apocalypse was going to be handled. I was jumping up and down when they announced that the Four Horsemen were going to have a big part in it as well. And I was extra pumped to hear that Angel, aka Archangel, was going to be in it, because Archangel, as we all know, is a big part of the Four Horsemen and in the X-Men stories. So I was really excited to see that. And when I saw Olivia Munn as Psylocke, I was absolutely blown away. She looked exactly like she was from the comic books. It was almost like she was pulled from the comic books and brought to life. And they made some changes. You know, Magneto was part of the Four Horsemen. We know that was not the case in the comic books, but I was just really, really excited to see how they were going to pull this off. And also, it's not much of a big deal, but it was for me. There was going to be a scene where Charles Xavier would lose his hair and reveal the trademark bald headed look that we would know Xavier for. So, expectations were really high. However, when I saw how Apocalypse looked, I was really disappointed. I mean, first of all, Apocalypse wasn't even big. He looked quite short. I remember a friend messaged me saying, "Are we getting Apocalypse or are we getting Ivan Ooze from Power Rangers but just a more rebooted slash upgraded look?" And when he showed me the picture of Apocalypse, which is this one here, I was like, oh no, what have they done? This isn't Apocalypse. This is not my Apocalypse I know and love from the comics and cartoons. I mean, Oscar Isaac did a great job. I'm not disputing him. He's a wonderful actor. He did a really good job with what he had to work with. But I don't know really, just his look. I had issues with the look of Apocalypse. I mean, sure, he did feel like a threat, but anyone who knows Apocalypse from the cartoon and they know from the comic books, Apocalypse is he's a badass. He's like on the dark side sort of level, you know. This is a guy who he's been around for thousands of years. He's got every single power of every single mutant. This is a guy who could actually fuck up the X-Men, and it just didn't come across that way to me. I mean, the way he was defeated, all the X-Men. Well, obviously, if you're going to have someone as big and powerful as Apocalypse, you need all the X-Men to defeat him. But I don't know really. Maybe it's just me. I don't know. I just wanted something really special with Apocalypse, and I wasn't feeling it. Not one bit. Sorry to say. I mean, I thought the overall movie was okay. Probably not as strong as Days of Future Past. I mean, it's not terrible like X-Men 3. It was okay, but I watched it again recently. I mean, it's not as bad as I remembered, but I was just really disappointed how they handled Apocalypse. I thought Apocalypse could have been so much more. I mean, Oscar Isaac, as I said already, wonderful actor, but I personally wouldn't have casted him as Apocalypse. The guy I would have casted, bless his soul, he's no longer with us, is Michael Clarke Duncan. I mean, anyone who's seen Michael Clarke Duncan, he is built like a huge shithouse. He's got the voice, he had the look, he had the physique, he had the whole package. If he was still alive, I would have definitely have casted him without question. He would have been perfect. But that's not to say that this film was all bad. There was some cool stuff. There was some great moments in this movie. One of my favourite moments in X-Men Apocalypse was the cameo of Hugh Jackman, who played Wolverine once again. And this time he was Weapon X, as part of Stryker's Weapon X program. And Jean Grey and Cyclops and Nightcrawler set him free, and Wolverine just basically goes on this bloody killing spree, going around fucking up all of Stryker's men and just basically beating the crap out of everyone. And that was a really cool scene. Even though Hugh Jackman had zero dialogue in this scene, he kicked a lot of ass, and it was a lot of fun to see. And it was also quite fun to see a young Jean Grey interacting with Wolverine. So that made for a really fun moment, and I like that scene where she goes into his head and basically gives him a couple of his memories back, and he takes off the headgear and he just runs away into the woods. I thought that was a really good moment. I really enjoyed that one a lot. And speaking of Jean Grey would end up playing a very big role at the end of Apocalypse, where she got to use her power to her fullest, and we got a little hint of the Dark Phoenix, which obviously this is setting up for the Dark Phoenix movie, which is out this week. So that was quite cool. I'm curious to see how they'll handle the Dark Phoenix. I wasn't a big fan of the way they handled it in X-Men 3, so it's going to be quite interesting to see how they'll pull it off this time round. I want it to do well, so we'll just have to wait and see. So Jean Grey ended up defeating Apocalypse in the end, which made for quite a big climax, so to speak. So mega props to Sophie Turner for doing an excellent job in that scene. And last but surely not least, the best scene for me was seeing all of the X-Men in their full costumes, which kind of reminded me of the 90s cartoon, which I thought made for a really cool ending. And it was really cool to see all of the members of the team finally officially become proper X-Men, so that was quite cool to see that. And also we get an after credits scene where we see a group of businessmen go to Stryker's secret bunker, and they pick up a test tube of blood labelled Weapon X and put it into a suitcase. Now, I wasn't entirely sure what the hell was going on here, but there was one thing that stood out that absolutely blew my mind. We saw a hint of Essex Corp. Now, for anyone who knows what Essex Corp is, Nathaniel Essex, you know who he is, I know who he is. It's none other than Mr. Sinister. Now, when I saw this, I was screaming inside. I thought, yes, we are actually finally getting Mr. Sinister in the next X-Men movie. Bring it on. And you know what? He's not even going to be in the movie. Now, I don't know what the reason is why Mr. Sinister has never been in an X-Men movie, but that's not something I'm really going to get into now. That's going to be probably for another video for another time. But just the fact that we got a hint of Mr. Sinister was just absolutely awesome. I'm hoping one day they'll follow it up, but we'll have to see. But I'm just really glad that we got a little tease of Mr. Sinister. So we go to the next movie, which is none other than Logan, which came out in 2017. Now, it was stated going into this movie that Logan would be Hugh Jackman's final outing as Wolverine. So there was a lot of high expectations, a lot of interest and intrigue about how Hugh Jackman was going to bow out as Wolverine. And also, Patrick Stewart made his return as Charles Xavier. So we got to see these two revisit that classic chemistry that made the early X-Men movies so special. And I would have to say, this gets thrown around a lot, but I would have to say this is probably one of the best comic book movies of all time. Certainly up there with, like other superhero movies like Iron Man 1 and, Batman Returns and The Dark Knight and those sort of films. But this film stands on its own more above those films because it told a really powerful story. It was quite emotional at times, very dark, very sad, quite gory in lots of places. And the sight of seeing Logan dying with a big beard, just looking a mess, he's pretty much the last mutant standing. All his friends, all the members of the X-Men are all gone and he's like the last one left. It really had that sense of closure that you knew going into this film that this was it. This was going to be it. You know, this was the end. But you didn't know how you got to the end. And also, you know, we got his daughter, you know, X-23, who was the little girl who was experimented on, and she got adamantium claws just like Wolverine. So that was good to see that side as well of things. And yeah, it was just really emotional, and the way Logan practically sacrifices himself to take out the Wolverine clone was really good, and it was really sad. I remember watching it. You know, I knew something was going to happen. I didn't think he was going to die, so to have him die really was a real punch in the guts, so to speak. And I remember watching it. It was quite a shock. I was like, okay, I wasn't expecting that, and it was really cool. It was a really good moment, and the ending where the kids put two branch sticks shaped like an X, that was an awesome way to end the film. I thought, you know, you couldn't ask for a better way to bow out. Hugh Jackman bowed out as Wolverine in the only way we know how, and the only way he knows how. He went out like a badass. He went out like a man, the way we know him for, and you know, there's no other way to say that. He went out like a badass, no pun intended. And Logan movie was, even just I'm talking about it, I still get a bit emotional talking about it, but definitely one of the best comic book movies of all time. In fact, I'm probably going to revisit it at some point. I probably will watch it again just to remind myself how well done this film was. With the phase 3 of the movies almost drawing to a close, there has been a lot of speculation about which direction Marvel Studios will go in for the phase 4 of the movies, and especially with the Fantastic Four and the X-Men now officially bought out by Marvel Studios, there has been a lot of questions and interest about how these two teams will be integrated into the Marvel's cinematic universe. And especially now with The Dark Phoenix being the last Fox-produced movie of the X-Men, a lot of questions are being asked about X-Men's future in the movies. So now this brings me to my theory on how I would like to see the X-Men be brought into the MCU, and what kind of movie I would like it to be. Now, for the first time, I'm going to come up with two theories as opposed to just one, like I've done in previous videos. My first theory being, what if during the Infinity War and Endgame, and after Thanos' snap with the Infinity Gauntlet, what if the X-Men have been around all this time and Charles Xavier has used his mental block powers to basically make himself and all the X-Men invisible, so that when Thanos done the snap, he didn't snap the X-Men because he didn't detect them, so virtually making all mutants invisible. So that would be my first theory. The second theory, which is one I'm going to probably roll with, but also incorporates some of the first theory as well. Now, in Avengers Endgame, it was mentioned and shown that they did time travel. Now, I saw in the trailer of Spider-Man Far From Home that Mysterio is from another Earth, and the multiverse was first referenced. Now, what if the X-Men are from another Earth, so to speak? So the portals are opened and the X-Men somehow ended up on our Earth. Now, what I would like to see for an X-Men movie in the MCU is I would like to see them focus on the original X-Men. That's the original 5. Cyclops, Iceman, Angel, Beast, and Marvel Girl, otherwise known as Jean Grey. What I would have for these guys is they're already established as a team, just like I mentioned in my previous video about the Fantastic Four. This will be the same sort of thing for the X-Men. The X-Men, they've been together for a couple of years, and what you could have for the movie is set it back in the past, in flashback, in 1963. So they're already here in our world, on Earth, from another Earth where mutants live, and the whole film could be in flashback. So they're recounting all the events of how they got together, how they all met, and how they became the X-Men. So you could go from there, really. So two possible scenarios you could have. One, as I just said, you could have the X-Men already here, but just hidden by Charles to stop them from being snapped by Thanos. And the second one you could have, which I probably like a bit more, is have the X-Men from another Earth where all mutants live there, and they come into our world and they just recount the events of how they got together. Now, for the main villain, now here's a tricky one. I'm not sure who you could have as the main villain. Possibly Magneto. I know we've seen Magneto a lot in the X-Men movies, but he's an important part of the X-Men. So I would probably have Magneto as the main villain first, but I wouldn't just have him be defeated and, that's be the end of it. I would have Magneto going around recruiting different mutants who have also come to our Earth and start putting together, his brotherhood. So that could be for the sequel. You could have X-Men Rise of the Brotherhood. For the first X-Men movie, just a geek in me, I'm going to say it, I would like the first X-Men movie to be called The Uncanny X-Men. So that's like a shout out to the first comic book back in 1963. I love the name X-Men, but there's just something to it called The Uncanny X-Men. So you could have, as I said, these guys were hidden by Charles to protect them from Thanos snapping them out of existence, and you could have them be revealed to the entire world from another Earth and go from there, really. So that would be my way of bringing the X-Men into the MCU. And what I would like to see also for the X-Men, I'd like to see them focus more on the original members. I love Wolverine, I love Storm, I love Gambit, I love Colossus, I love all those guys, don't get me wrong, but I think it'd be better if we start right at the very beginning with the original team. I mean, obviously you're going to have those other guys come into the movie eventually, but I'd like to see them slowly work their way in. So when we do get the final definitive X-Men team, I don't know what film that will be, depending on how many they're signed up for, we finally get the original team. But I'd like to see for the first couple of movies, maybe 3 movies, just them focusing on the original members, the original 5, because I've started to grow to like the original 5. I mean, I love the 90s X-Men team, they're awesome, but there's just something I like about bright and colourful. Me and my friend always talk about this, have bright and colourful, but also dark at the same time, story-wise. And it works, because you've got a perfect balance of everything. So that's the kind of film I'd like to see for the X-Men. Bright, colourful costumes, with a powerful, dark story, and awesome dialogue. And that's it, really. And there you have it, guys. Or another way you could introduce the X-Men into the MCU is give them their own live-action TV show. We've got Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., so why not give that sort of treatment for the X-Men? You could tell stories in 13 to 15 episodes for 45 to 50 plus minutes long, And the payoff you could have for the stories is their movies. That's another cool way I think the X-Men could be introduced into the MCU. So yeah, that's pretty much my theory on how I'd like to see the X-Men be brought into the MCU. I'd like to see them either go with them being here already but just hidden, or the other one go with them being from another Earth through the multiverse and they just somehow come into our world and start living here. So that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed listening to me talking about all X-Men. I hope you enjoyed listening to this my theories on how I'd like to see this work. Also, I hope you enjoyed the little trip down memory lane with all these X-Men movies and about the cartoon. So I'm going to leave this here for you. Let me know what your thoughts and comments are. Hope you enjoyed listening, and I will see you next time. Remember, everyone, mutant and proud.